Margaret Atwood has said more than once that everything in The Handmaid's Tale is based on something that really happened. Most people nod politely at that and move on, assuming she's talking loosely, pulling a thread here, a headline there, weaving it all into fiction. The general consensus is that Gilead is an exaggeration, a worst-case scenario thought experiment, a cautionary tale stretched to its narrative breaking point. That consensus is wrong. Not just a little wrong. Embarrassingly, disturbingly, keep you up at night wrong. Because when you actually sit down and compare the Republic of Gilead's state-controlled breeding program to what Nazi Germany built with the Lebensborn initiative, you realize that Atwood wasn't exaggerating. If anything, she was being restrained. The real program was more systematic, more sprawling, and in several specific ways, more horrifying than anything Hulu has put on screen. Let's talk about it. So here's the version most people carry around in their heads. Gilead, the theocratic regime in The Handmaid's Tale, forces fertile women called handmaids into ritualized sexual servitude. They're assigned to elite households. They're raped in a monthly ceremony. If they conceive, the child is taken and raised by the commander's wife. The handmaids have no names, no rights, no autonomy. It is, by design, one of the most viscerally upsetting dystopias in modern fiction. And people treat it like fiction. Pure fiction. They praise Atwood's dark imagination. They call it a feminist nightmare scenario. They debate whether it could ever really happen, as though the question is theoretical. Here's what most viewers don't realize. The Lebensborn program wasn't a footnote. It wasn't some fringe experiment run by a rogue officer. It was an official, state-funded, Heinrich Himmler-endorsed institution that operated across multiple countries for over a decade. And its mission statement, stripped of the bureaucratic language, was essentially identical to Gilead's. Breed racially pure children. Control the women who bear them. Redistribute those children to ideologically approved families. Erase the mothers from the story entirely. The main difference? Gilead is a novel. Lebensborn had office buildings. The program launched in 1935, and its name translates roughly to Fount of Life or Spring of Life, which is exactly the kind of poetic branding you'd expect from a regime that put a lot of effort into making atrocities sound noble. Here's what people generally believe about Lebensborn: that it was a network of maternity homes for unwed mothers. A kind of dark charity. Uncomfortable, sure, but relatively passive. Women walked in voluntarily, had their babies, and walked out. That's the sanitized version, and it's the one that survived in a lot of post-war narratives because it was convenient for everyone involved to minimize what actually happened. What the evidence actually shows is something far more deliberate. Himmler didn't just want to shelter mothers, he wanted to manufacture a master race on an industrial timeline. The program actively recruited women, specifically young women who met strict racial criteria. Blonde hair, blue eyes, no Jewish ancestry for at least 3 generations. SS officers were essentially encouraged, and in some cases directly ordered, to father children with these women, whether they were married to them or not. Fidelity was irrelevant. Romance was irrelevant. What mattered was genetic output. Women who entered Lebensborn homes were evaluated like livestock. Their skulls were measured. Their ancestry was audited. If they passed, they received excellent medical care, which sounds generous until you understand the reason. The baby was the product, and the mother was the packaging. Once the child was born, the women were frequently pressured to give up their babies to SS families or state-run institutions. Many were told they had no choice. Some were told their children had died when they hadn't. If that sounds familiar, congratulations. You've just described the ceremony, the birth ritual, and the child redistribution system from The Handmaid's Tale. Except this version had filing cabinets and government letterhead. Now here's where it gets worse, and I want to be specific about this because the comparisons matter. In Gilead, the handmaids are taken from their homes and forced into service. It's brutal, and it's portrayed as the ultimate violation of bodily autonomy. Most viewers assume this is the extreme end of the spectrum. The Lebensborn program went further. As Nazi Germany expanded into occupied territories, particularly Norway, Poland, and the Baltic states, the program didn't just recruit women. It took children, directly, from their families. This is the part that tends to drop people's jaws. Tens of thousands of children across Eastern Europe were kidnapped, literally seized from their parents because they looked Aryan enough. Blonde hair, light eyes, the right bone structure. SS officers and race examiners would enter towns, inspect the children, and remove the ones who met their criteria. These children were shipped to Lebensborn homes or directly to German families. Their names were changed, their records were destroyed. Their birth languages were beaten out of them until they spoke only German. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't wartime propaganda. The Nuremberg trials documented it extensively. Estimates range from 20,000 to 200,000 children stolen across occupied Europe. And the range is that wide because the Nazis were thorough about destroying the paperwork. Gilead takes babies from handmaids. The Third Reich took children from entire nations. Outdoes gave us a closed system. History gave us an international child trafficking network run by the state. There's another parallel that deserves attention, and it's one that cuts deeper than the institutional machinery. It's about what happened to the women and children afterward. In The Handmaid's Tale, one of the most devastating elements is the erasure. Handmaids lose their names. They become Offred, Offglen, Off-Warren, possessive labels that define them only in relation to their assigned commander. Their previous identities are systematically deleted. The children they bear will never know them. Most people assume this kind of identity destruction is literary device, dramatic exaggeration for emotional effect. The Lebensborn children would disagree. After the war, the vast majority of stolen children were never returned. Their original identities had been so thoroughly erased that reunification was impossible in most cases. Many grew up in German families and never learned the truth. Some found out decades later, in their 50s or 60s, that they weren't German at all, that they had been taken from Polish or Norwegian or Czech families who spent their entire lives searching for them. And the mothers from the Lebensborn homes? Their silence was nearly total. In Norway, women who had relationships with German soldiers during the occupation were publicly humiliated after liberation. Their heads were shaved. They were paraded through streets. They were called collaborators and traitors, regardless of whether they had been coerced. Their Lebensborn children, around 12,000 of them in Norway alone, were stigmatized, institutionalized, and in many documented cases, abused by the very society that claimed to be liberating them. The cruelty didn't end when the program ended, it just changed hands. In Gilead, at least, the narrative acknowledges the handmaids as victims. In post-war Europe, the real women were punished twice. So why put these two things side by side? It's not to diminish The Handmaid's Tale. Atwood's work is brilliant precisely because she understood that the most effective horror is the kind rooted in precedent. She didn't invent Gilead from nothing. She assembled it from things that had already happened and asked the reader to look at the pieces and recognize them. But there's a common belief that floats around discussions of her work, this idea that the story is a warning about what could happen. Future tense, hypothetical, and that framing, while well-intentioned, does a disservice to the people who already lived through it. The Lebensborn program wasn't a dystopian thought experiment. It was policy. It had budgets. It had administrators who went home to their families at night. And when it was over, the world largely looked away. The main Lebensborn trial at Nuremberg resulted in acquittals for most of the defendants. The judges ruled that the program itself wasn't inherently criminal because it provided welfare services to mothers and children. The kidnapping charges stuck for a few, but the sentences were light. Most of the administrators walked free within a few years. Gilead's commanders face revolutionary justice at the end of the story. The Lebensborn officers mostly got to retire. The fiction is disturbing because it feels possible. The history is more disturbing because it was real, and because the consequences were so inadequate that most people today have never even heard the word Lebensborn. And this brings us to something that historians are still grappling with. Of the thousands of children taken by the Lebensborn program, most were never identified. Their records were burned. Their names were changed multiple times. Many of them are still alive today. Elderly men and women living in Germany, Austria, Scandinavia, and beyond, who have no idea that the families who raised them were not their own. That somewhere, decades ago, a mother in Poland or Norway or Czechoslovakia lost a child and never stopped looking. There are organizations working on this right now, using DNA databases and surviving fragments of Nazi records to try to reconnect these families before it's too late. Some of them have succeeded, most have not. And the clock is running out. But there's one specific thread in this story that almost nobody talks about, and it raises questions that make even seasoned historians uncomfortable. What happened to the Lebensborn children who were deemed failures? The ones who, after kidnapping and racial evaluation, didn't quite measure up? The ones who were sent back, or more accurately, sent somewhere? The records on those children are almost non-existent, and the silence around their fate is deafening. That's a story for the next video. If you want to be here when I tell it, the subscribe button is right there. And honestly, these are the kinds of histories that deserve more people paying attention.